Hello and good, I guess, night, because it's nearly 11 p.m. here in Seoul, South Korea. But it's time to meet our next team that will be playing at VCT Ascension Pacific 2024. We are down to our 4 teams, the 4 regions that were top seeds last year at Ascension Bangkok in 2023. And, of course, we will be checking out the 3rd and 4th seeds first. It's going to be NAOS Esports for today's video. Now's the time for the Filipino representatives to redeem themselves from the close but empty-handed results of last year's Ascension in Bangkok. The Philippines this year did have some decent roster shakeups, with several VCT Pacific players actually returning to the local regional scene, such as Dubstep and EJ, while other players tried to find new combinations amongst themselves to find success. Through all these changes, it seemed maybe we'd be seeing a new victor rise up amongst all the different rivalries, but when it was all said and done, it's going to be NAOS who gets another shot to enter VCT Pacific Ascension 2024. Let's meet our players. So here are our starting 5 for NAOS Esports: Mosier, Nexi, Emin, Papichulo, and Ja. Of course, if you've been following the scene, you'll recognize that Mosier, Papichulo, and Ja were actually all part of this roster that played at Ascension last year. So already quite a bit of a boon here, a bit of an advantage for this team with the experience they had performing at Ascension. Then we have Nexi being picked up from one of the rival organizations in Oasis Gaming, and Emin was actually one of the players that returned from VCT Pacific, having been on the team for RRQ last year. Returned, had a brief stint on a different team alongside EJ, actually a couple of these other guys as well, Mosier and one of the players that left NAOS Esports, Senor Carl. They kind of banded together to make their own team to qualify for challengers, and then a couple of them, as we can see right here, rejoined NAOS. So Mosier and Emin coming into NAOS off of that qualification. So Mosier kind of comes back home onto NAOS Esports, whereas Emin now joining this team, and he is now the current IGL for NAOS Esports. There are a couple changes though. Ja used to be the primary duelist last year, and Mosier being the primary sentinel. But since then, they have swapped roles. It seems like they did a little bit of experimenting, especially in the beginning of the year, but this seems to have been mostly settled down. So Mosier, the primary duelist, playing, all the hot duelists right now, in terms of if you're only having that one duelist, the dive duelist, so to speak, it's going to be the Raze Jet Neon. So clearly Mosier's job to open up space, to create angles, to entry in to a site. Then you have Nexi, who is a bit of a flex. I mean, I would say mostly playing a lot of the initiators, but going to be that secondary Viper whenever they so need. But it does seem that Nexi is also kind of the go-to Sova, so that's something to keep an eye on when it comes to the map drafts and compositions. Emin, primarily going to be playing these initiators, a lot of the ones that are kind of self-sufficient. So even if you only have one initiator, Emin's going to be the one that's playing it. Quite a few flashes, but still able to get info. A lot of these kind of dual initiators, so to speak. Then you've got Papichulo. If you followed the scene at all, if you followed Ascension at all last year, I mean, he is the controller. He is so reliable. We'll talk more about him later, but I mean, Omen, obviously go-to, Viper, and then Brimstone. And last but not least, Ja coming in now as the Sentinel and playing, okay, Cypher, right? He's become kind of the meta this year in 2024. The Killjoy, but Chamber sneaking his way into the top 3 most played in the past 3 months, which is basically all of Split 2 here for Philippines. Now, the Chamber was used quite a bit on Lotus. That's why it's able to make it into the rankings here for Ja. They played Lotus quite a few times, and they employed the Chamber several times before eventually swapping out of it. So that's something to keep an eye on, but obviously Ja and Mosier both having played both Duelist and Sentinel, that gives them a little bit more flexibility in terms of like the aggression and the mechanical prowess and things like that. To talk about NAOS's journey to Ascension, we actually have to call it the journey back to Ascension, because it all begins as they entered Ascension Bangkok last year in 2023 as the Filipino representatives. They were looking pretty strong and yet lacked just a bit of the discipline and cleanliness to be able to contend against the best, eventually losing in a tough best of 3 to the runners-up Scars. Despite the disappointment, this roster still looked pretty solid, so it was slightly surprising and a little bit sad when we saw the news that NAOS would be making some roster changes. I mean, initially even Mosier was departing from the team alongside players like Senor Carl and Wits. But eventually, Mosier rejoins the team, and then we have NAOS picking up Emin from RQ and Nexi from Oasis Esports. This came along with some role changes we covered earlier, and NAOS is looking pretty darn strong from the get-go. I mean, they're right back in the running as one of the favorites for the Philippines. In fact, they actually only lost one match in the group stage to NAOS Esports, but that came back to bite them when they still couldn't get the revenge match in the grand finals, eventually giving that Split 1 title to NAOS. Split 2 begins with NAOS getting actually their revenge right away against NAOS Esports, but it turns out this time it's Oasis who comes up, steps up to the plate, and returns with a vengeance. And when we say vengeance here, we kind of mean vengeance because Wits had joined this team by then, and obviously having been on NAOS before, so kind of a revenge, grudge match. And so they're able to get their victory, and NAOS once again has another, singular loss in that group stage. It still looks pretty good for NAOS, barely dropping any maps overall, and they even made sure not to slip up in the rematches against Zol and Oasis in the playoff bracket. Now, tied 2-2 against NAOS Esports in 2024, NAOS and Zol would meet one last time to decide who would get the ticket to go to VCT Ascension. It ends up being quite a close match. In fact, probably as close as it can get, because not only did it go full 5 maps in a best of 5, but we had 3 overtimes across the 5 maps in this matchup. If the second map wasn't so one-sided, this probably would have broken quite a few records. But amidst all the bloodbath, it's going to be NAOS who claims the crown once more. Now, watching some of the NAOS matches, I'm not quite sure how to summarize this team. I mean, NAOS seems to be that team that does a lot of things very well. They have solid mechanics, they've got pretty good foundations, and I didn't see them doing anything egregiously wrong. And yet, by the end of Split 2, they also didn't exactly show me any crazy new innovations that kind of showcase their very own color and style. I would actually argue that some of their games almost seemed somewhat simple from a strategic aspect, but it wasn't bad enough that it felt like one-dimensional or all-in. Both their attacks and defense revolve around a set plan at the start of the round, relying quite a bit on hard reads and good trades. But NAOS still had a few rounds in the grand finals where they would, leave a lurk for last-minute rotations. Granted, sometimes they got very, very, very last minute, but obviously they had their eye on the clock because then they would employ whatever agents and skills they needed to make sure the rotation went through. On defense, initially, this type of mindset made me feel like it wasn't great play since they would play so passive and give up so much space. But the reads were just good enough that they could win out a lot of good fights, and if it was wrong, their teammates would also have the mechanics to hold on just long enough for backup to arrive in time. I guess what I'm trying to say is it feels like NAOS eventually settled on something where they can really let their firepower shine through the basic defaults and set plays, making sure the spacing and timing was perfected in that aspect, rather than inventing crazy new ideas and other plays, that kind of innovate the overall meta. It's actually a great thing. It's not a bad thing. It just didn't scream at me for attention. To supplement that style, the 2 players I'll be choosing as my key players to watch are actually going to be the players who I expect to be performing the Heimlich maneuver for this team to prevent choking in yet another important match for this region, and it's going to be Papichulo and Jaw. Now, if you follow the scene or, again, last year's tournament at all, these are not surprising picks, especially Papichulo. Papichulo had the most clutches at last year's Ascension tournament, and in fact had the most clutches in Split 2 of Challengers in the Philippines this year as well. Not only did he have the most clutches, he actually ended Split 2 with the highest kill-death ratio and kills, assists, survives trades of the entire tournament, with nearly the lowest first deaths per round on top of all of those stats. A 24% clutch rate across 118 attempts is insane. Basically, every 4th time he'll get in a situation, he'll get you a round that you probably should have lost. The grand finals were perhaps a bit quiet for Papichulo, compared to his other performances, but you can never really write him off in those do-or-die scenarios. And for a team that may rely a bit more on their actual fighting and firepower, having a strong backup plan, a solid insurance plan like Papichulo, if you will, is massive value. It's actually a similar vein that I'm picking Jaw as one of the key players as well. Now, don't get me wrong, Moja did an amazing job returning to that primary duelist role, and even in the grand finals, put up some amazing numbers and great highlights for the team to be able to cross that finish line. However, Ja was just hitting some nasty shots throughout the entire best of 5. I mean, we've seen just how good it is to have a calm and crisp Sentinel back in the VCT Pacific with the likes of Meteor, Flashback, and in fact, even another Filipino talent that joined halfway through the year, Wild Oreo. So Ja going over to the Sentinel role and becoming this rock solid fragger is huge for this squad. In fact, I'd argue this might be what brings them much more stability than last year's squad. Moving on to the map pool, it's mostly good, but the current favorites, the go-to maps around the world of Lotus and Sunset, are a bit on the weaker side. And that could spell trouble in the draft because those are two maps that, I mean, everyone's been playing nonstop the entire year. We haven't seen the Abyss, though, and given how Ja is looking, I could see them actually liking Abyss and, you know, being able to kind of set up a good Sentinel position on the defense, things like that. Some good lurks for Ja in mid, you know, something that could work out for their firepower, and the rest of them kind of battle through the other side of the map. For Lotus and Sunset, I imagine we see small changes to their comps as well. In fact, Vice is actually going to be available for this tournament, if I'm not mistaken. So who knows? Maybe Vice gets added into the mix, and maybe they'll set up some more trap plays that really enable them to fight even more aggressively. Outside of that, as I often do, I do want to give a shout to their bind having over 60% win rates on both the attacking and defending sides. That's huge. And then the Icebox, 6-0. I mean, that's huge. And they've changed comps. I mean, seemingly because they wanted to kind of stay on top of things and not get too lax. And I will say the Harbor composition didn't look very smooth in the grind finals, but at the end of the day, a win's a win. So a 6-0 record on that map, that's going to be interesting to watch if players, or if other teams rather, actually ban that out or pick into it knowing that there's so much data out there. So that's NAOS Esports. It almost feels like it's very standard. Like I'm writing this up, I was watching their games, and just having gone through it and talking about it, it feels very standard. And again, I don't mean that as a good or bad thing. It's just an observation in that this is a pretty strong team. The roster's quite stacked. You've got a lot of experience on this team. You've got people who have direct experience from Ascension last year. You have players like Emin who have actually played on VCT Pacific last year. There's a lot of things going for them. They can play very aggressive. They're all individually talented. And so far from what we've seen within their own region, they aren't overheating as much, kind of throwing away whatever leads they might have had. Now, I will say the finals, obviously a lot of overtimes, but I think it's mostly just like both teams going at it back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. But the likes of Papichulo and Ja being able to kind of sit there and lock in some of those rounds that NAOS would need to find that stability, I think was a very, very noticeable part of their success. So the question is can they continue that against teams outside of their region? How often have we said this for the Philippines? The Philippines are cracked. The Filipino players are cracked. There's no doubt about that. And they're overall, the teams are all pretty good too. But when push comes to shove, they just can't close it out. And I'm wondering, is this the roster that can do it this year at Ascension? I know there's a lot of you out there that are rooting for the Philippines. If you have followed their entire journey this year, let me know down in the comments below. How far do you expect this team to go? Can they redeem themselves from last year and maybe lift up that trophy and bring more slots for the Philippines into VCT Pacific in 2025? That's going to be it for this one. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to leave a like on the video as well. That helps a ton. And of course, don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we still have more teams to cover, when the next one being Boom Esports from Indonesia.